It was just supposed to be a weekend getaway. Alex had been under stress from work, and his friend Dave had suggested they take a breather, maybe head to an Airbnb out in the countryside to unwind. "It'll be just the thing, man," Dave had insisted, a grin stretching across his face. "A place without cell service, no distractions, just us and nature." The house they rented was old, the kind that creaks and groans with the slightest breeze, standing tall against the backdrop of mist-shrouded trees. As they approached it, Alex felt an unshakable chill, a sense of something watching, waiting. But he brushed it off, attributing it to the gloomy weather and his own nerves. The first night was uneventful, even peaceful. They unpacked, made themselves at home, and Dave cracked open a bottle of whiskey. The crackling fire filled the room with warmth as they sat around it, laughing and sharing stories. But that was before they heard the footsteps overhead. They paused, looking at each other, the laughter dying in their throats. "Did you hear that?" Alex whispered, the color draining from his face. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Someone was up there, moving slowly, as if dragging their feet across the dusty floorboards of the attic. "Maybe it's just an animal," Dave said, though his voice lacked conviction. They had been told the house was old and empty, but they hadn't thought to check every room, every nook. The attic was off limits, or so they had been told by the owner. Alex's mind spun with possibilities, but the sounds grew louder, like a dragging, scraping noise, as if something was being pulled across the floor. As they stood frozen, they could feel the weight of whatever was in the attic, pressing down, suffocating. Neither of them wanted to go up there, but they couldn't ignore it either. Finally, Dave grabbed a flashlight, gesturing for Alex to follow. "We'll just check and make sure, all right?" His voice was shaking, and Alex knew he was just as terrified as he was. Dave gripped the flashlight so tightly his knuckles were white, his face drained of color as he and Alex approached the attic door. The closer they got, the louder the scratching sound became. It wasn't consistent, but seemed to stop and start, like someone shifting their weight and then pausing to listen. "Maybe we should just leave it alone," Alex whispered, a sense of dread spreading over him. He could almost feel it, thick and heavy, like a fog seeping through the cracks of the old house. Dave shook his head. "We have to check it out," he said, though his voice was trembling. His hand reached out for the doorknob, hesitating just long enough for Alex to wonder if he might change his mind. But then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he twisted the knob, the old metal creaking under his grip. The door swung open, revealing a steep, dark staircase that led up into the attic. A foul, musty odor wafted down, making them both wince and cover their noses. The air was thick and stale, and the darkness seemed to press down on them as if it were alive, pulsing with some kind of ominous energy. Dave aimed the flashlight up the stairs, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal old, dusty floorboards and cobwebs that clung to the ceiling like veils. But nothing else. No sign of movement, no shadows shifting in the light. They took a hesitant step onto the first stair, the wood creaking loudly beneath them. Alex felt his heart racing, every beat echoing in his ears as they made their way up. The flashlight flickered, casting strange, eerie shapes on the walls. Every few steps they would pause, listening, as if expecting to hear something or someone whispering in the darkness above. When they reached the top of the stairs, they stood at the edge of the attic, hesitant to step further inside. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and the silence was absolute, pressing in on them from all sides. Then, just as they were about to turn back, they heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper, like someone breathing just behind them. "Get out," it seemed to say, the words a faint hiss that sent chills down their spines. They spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty darkness stretching out around them. Alex's hands were shaking, and he felt a sense of panic rising in his chest. "Let's go," he whispered urgently, tugging on Dave's arm. "We shouldn't be here." But Dave didn't move. His eyes were fixed on something in the corner, where the flashlight beam had landed. Alex followed his gaze, his breath catching in his throat as he saw it too. A small, dusty wooden box, half hidden beneath an old, moth-eaten blanket. It looked out of place, newer than the rest of the attic's decaying contents, as if someone had recently left it there. "Dave, let's not," Alex pleaded, but Dave was already moving toward it, the flashlight trembling in his hand. He knelt down, his fingers hovering over the box as if something were drawing him to it. Without a word, he lifted the lid, and inside, they saw it. An old photograph of a family, their faces blurred and smudged, their expressions twisted in horror. And beneath it, a single faded newspaper clipping with the headline, "Family vanishes from house, no traces found." His shoulder, reading the text with wide eyes. It detailed a family, parents and 2 children, who had mysteriously vanished from this very house decades ago. The article described police searches, endless community vigils, and a lingering mystery with no resolution. As Dave placed the clipping back in the box, the flashlight flickered again, casting the room in darkness for a split second. When the light returned, both he and Alex froze. Standing in the far corner of the attic was a figure, a tall, shadowy outline that seemed to absorb the light, its shape almost human but wrong, twisted and shifting as though made of smoke and shadow. Who are you?" Dave managed to stammer, though his voice sounded hollow, like it barely made it past his lips. The shadow didn't respond, but slowly it seemed to raise an arm, pointing toward the box in Dave's hand. Alex tugged on Dave's sleeve, desperate to leave, but Dave was transfixed. His gaze locked on the figure as if hypnotized. The shadow's shape wavered and a whisper filled the attic, each word chilling them to the core. "You shouldn't have come." The air grew colder, and Alex felt his skin prickling with fear. He yanked on Dave's arm again, and this time he broke free from his trance. They bolted down the stairs, stumbling over each other in their haste to get away. Behind them, they could hear the door slamming shut with a force that shook the walls, the shadowy figure seeming to dissolve into the darkness. Once they were out of the attic, they sprinted down to the living room, slamming the door shut behind them. They leaned against it, catching their breath, their hearts pounding like drums. "That thing," Alex gasped. "It wasn't human, Dave." Dave nodded, his face pale and sweaty. "I know, but the box, it's like it was left there on purpose for us to find." Over the next few days, things only grew worse. Both Alex and Dave started experiencing vivid nightmares, each one filled with images of the shadowy figure lurking just out of sight, its whispers echoing in their minds even as they woke up drenched in cold sweat. They would see it in the corners of their rooms, flickering in reflections, always watching, always waiting. One night Alex woke to find the figure standing at the foot of his bed, staring down at him with hollow, unseeing eyes. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, frozen in terror as the figure leaned closer, whispering in his ear, "Leave, or suffer the same fate." Unable to bear it any longer, Alex and Dave returned to the attic, desperate to find a way to end the hauntings. The air was thick with an oppressive energy as they entered, and the shadow was there again, waiting for them in the corner, its form more solid, almost corporeal. "What do you want from us?" Dave shouted, his voice shaking with fear and anger. In response, the shadow pointed to the box again. Inside, they found a journal, its pages filled with scrawled writing. It belonged to the father of the vanished family, describing how they had unwittingly disturbed a malevolent force in the house. The father's final entry sent chills down their spines. "We tried to leave, but it wouldn't let us. It wants company. It won't ever let us go." Suddenly, the shadow lunged toward them, its form twisting and expanding, filling the room. Alex screamed as it engulfed them, the darkness wrapping around them like suffocating tendrils. They struggled, but it was like fighting against a heavy, thick fog that pulled them deeper into the shadows. Just as they felt they might be consumed entirely, Dave remembered the lighter in his pocket. With a trembling hand, he flicked it on, the tiny flame casting a warm glow that seemed to push the darkness back. The shadow hissed, recoiling from the light, its form dissolving around them. They stumbled back, holding the flame between them and the shadow, which writhed and screeched, its shape growing weaker, fading as the light grew stronger. In a final desperate surge, they bolted down the stairs, the shadow pursuing them but shrinking with every step they took into the light. They burst out of the house into the dawn, the sun's first rays cutting through the darkness and scattering the shadow behind them. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of town, breathless and shaking, the house looming ominously in the distance. They never returned to that house. Weeks later, Alex received a call that the house had mysteriously burned down, leaving nothing but ashes and the remnants of the attic where they had encountered the shadow. They were safe but haunted, both knowing they had barely escaped with their lives. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, sometimes Alex swore he could still hear a faint whisper drifting through his window, chilling him to his core. "I'm not done." It was a cold, rainy night, and the highway stretched on like an endless black ribbon under the dim glow of Jake's truck headlights. A veteran trucker, Jake had been on the road for more years than he could remember. But tonight, there was something different, something oppressive about the air. Maybe it was the relentless rain that pounded his windshield, or the fact that he was running on only a few hours of sleep. Just as he settled into his seat, adjusting the radio for any sign of life on the airwaves, he spotted a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. A young woman, drenched to the bone, her hair plastered against her face, was holding out her thumb, desperate for a ride. Jake's instincts screamed at him to keep driving. He rarely picked up hitchhikers, especially not at this hour. But the woman looked so helpless, shivering in the downpour, that he couldn't just leave her stranded. As he pulled over, the woman climbed in without a word, water dripping from her clothes onto the worn upholstery. She was pale, almost unnaturally so, with an intense look in her eyes as she glanced at Jake. After a moment, she murmured, "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would stop." "No problem," Jake replied, trying to sound casual. But there was something unsettling about her. She looked cold, but not a normal kind of cold. More like she had been standing in that rain for hours, her skin an almost bluish tint. He shook off the thought and focused on the road. After a few moments of silence, he asked, "So, where you headed?" The woman hesitated, her gaze fixed on something distant. Then softly she said, "Just up ahead, past the bridge." The way she said it made his skin crawl. There was no bridge for miles, at least none that he remembered. But Jake kept driving, hoping the unease that had crept into the truck would lift. As they drove in silence, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He glanced over at the woman who was staring straight ahead, her eyes hollow, as if lost in a memory only she could see. His knuckles tightened on the wheel, the air between them growing colder despite the truck's heater. Finally, he cleared his throat, hoping to break the tension. "So, what brings you out here in the middle of the night?" Her response was so soft he almost missed it. "I was waiting to get home." Jake's grip on the wheel tightened. He forced himself to keep talking, to keep her from sinking back into that unsettling silence. "Well, you'll be there soon," he offered, trying to sound reassuring. But as he said it, she turned to look at him, her expression blank, as though she didn't understand what he meant. Moments later, they passed an old, rusted sign for a bridge. Jake blinked, his memory scrambling. He didn't remember a bridge on this route, but he figured he must have missed it during his years on the road. He flicked his gaze toward his passenger, but she had turned back to the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "You must be tired," she said, almost too softly. "You need rest." Her voice seemed to echo in his mind, lulling him with a strange rhythmic pull. His eyelids grew heavy, and for a terrifying moment, he felt as though he was being drawn into a deep, dreamless sleep. Just as his vision began to blur, he jolted awake, gripping the wheel. What did you just say?" he demanded, his voice thick with fear. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she kept her eyes forward, her lips forming a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was as if she had said nothing at all. Jake swallowed, trying to shake off the strange haze that had clouded his mind. He was wide awake now, more alert than ever. As the minutes crawled by, he noticed the woman seemed almost too still, her body rigid and motionless except for her eyes, which scanned the road with an unsettling intensity. The rain continued to drum against the windshield, creating a hypnotic rhythm that he tried to ignore. Finally, unable to take the silence any longer, Jake asked, "You got family waiting for you up there?" The woman's head tilted slightly, as if pondering his question. "I used to. They've all moved on now." A cold shiver ran down his spine. The way she said it sounded more final than he could explain, almost like a warning. He was about to press her further when she abruptly pointed at something ahead. "There. Stop there." Jake looked forward, his heart hammering. The road stretched out endlessly into the darkness, but he spotted a small, unmarked dirt path veering off to the side. Hesitating, he slowed the truck, the headlights illuminating the narrow lane that seemed to vanish into the trees. "This doesn't look like a place anyone would live," he muttered almost to himself. "Please," she whispered, her voice a faint plea that cut through the noise of the rain. Without another word, she opened the door and stepped out into the mud, not even glancing back as she walked away from the truck and down the path, disappearing into the shadows. Something inside him screamed to stay put, to drive off and never look back. But an inexplicable pull urged him to follow. His legs moved on their own, carrying him after her, into the darkness. The path twisted and turned, winding deeper into the trees until Jake saw an old, decrepit house standing in a small clearing, its windows shattered, the wooden structure warped and weathered. It looked like it hadn't been touched by life for decades. He stared at it, unease blossoming into outright fear. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his arm. Startled, he turned, but there was no one there. His heart pounded as he took a shaky step back, convinced he'd made a terrible mistake. He scanned the area, expecting the woman to reappear, but she was nowhere to be seen. A whisper floated through the air, faint but unmistakable. "Come inside." Jake froze, his eyes fixed on the darkened doorway of the house. Against every instinct, he stepped forward, feeling as though he were being guided by an invisible force. He crossed the threshold and the air grew thick, heavy like a weight pressing down on his chest. Dust hung in the air, undisturbed, and the silence was absolute. As he stepped further in, he noticed framed pictures on the walls. He stopped to look at one, his blood turning to ice. It was a family photo, old and faded, but he recognized the young woman from the truck, her face staring back at him from the black and white image, surrounded by a family of strangers. "How?" he whispered, stumbling back, his mind racing. He had no time to make sense of it as the house seemed to come alive, the floorboards creaking under an invisible weight, the walls seeming to breathe. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him, sealing him inside. Jake banged on the door, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the suffocating silence. Desperation mounting, he raced through the house, searching for another way out. Each room was filled with remnants of a life left behind. Faded furniture, torn curtains, a broken clock ticking away the seconds of a forgotten past. He entered a small bedroom and froze. There, lying on the bed, was the woman, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling, her expression frozen in a look of sheer terror. Jake stumbled back, horrified. It couldn't be possible. She'd been with him just moments ago, alive and desperate for a ride. Then he saw it, scratched into the wood of the nightstand beside the bed, in jagged letters, "Help me." A wave of nausea washed over him. The truth was beginning to dawn on him, but he refused to accept it. He turned and ran, not caring where he went, as long as it was away from that haunting sight. But every corner he turned seemed to lead him back to the same room, the same horrific scene replaying before him. It was as if the house itself was toying with him, trapping him in an endless loop of terror. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake collapsed in the middle of the living room, his body and spirit broken. He was ready to accept whatever fate awaited him, the last vestiges of hope drained from his soul. That's when he heard it, a faint whisper, echoing from the shadows around him. It was her voice, soft and sorrowful. "You shouldn't have stopped." His eyes filled with tears as he whispered back, "What are you? Why did you bring me here?" The woman's voice drifted through the room, growing louder, filled with anguish. "I've been trapped here, waiting for someone who would listen, someone who would stay. You took the wrong turn, Jake. Now, you're part of this place." As the last word faded, a searing pain shot through his chest and he collapsed, gasping for air. His vision blurred, the room spinning as darkness closed in around him. The house had claimed him, and as he took his last breath, he understood. He was bound to this place, just like her, destined to haunt the lonely road, forever waiting for the next soul to wander in. It was a journey across the Nevada desert that Tom and his girlfriend Sarah would never forget. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the vast expanse of the desert stretched out before them, an endless ribbon of asphalt flanked by shadows. The empty road hummed under their tires as they drove, laughter and music filling the car. Sarah squinted into the darkness and nudged Tom. "I swear, there hasn't been a single other car on this road for hours. Isn't that a little weird?" Tom shrugged, smiling to ease her worry. "That's Nevada for you. Just a whole lot of nothing until you hit the next gas station." But as night enveloped them, a strange unease crept in. The road felt darker, more oppressive, and the laughter that had filled the car faded into an uncomfortable silence. Tom's fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel. There was an eerie stillness outside, the desert stretching endlessly, illuminated only by their headlights. After hours of driving, the needle on the fuel gauge dipped dangerously low. Tom squinted at the GPS, a chill running down his spine as it showed the next gas station miles away, deeper into the desert. "We don't really have a choice," he muttered, pulling onto a dusty, seemingly forgotten road that branched off from the main highway. A battered sign read, "Eldridge, 6 miles." The road twisted and turned, narrowing until it barely fit the car. The headlights illuminated little but scrub and rocks, casting bizarre, elongated shadows on either side. The farther they drove, the more suffocating the darkness became. Sarah glanced around, worry evident on her face. "Tom, maybe we should turn back. This doesn't feel right." But before he could answer, a small figure appeared on the side of the road, a hitchhiker, with a dusty hat pulled low over his eyes and a tattered backpack slung over one shoulder. He lifted a hand, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but his fingers splayed in a strange, stiff gesture, almost as though he were trying to warn them. Tom slowed the car, unsure, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't stop, this whole thing is giving me a really bad feeling. Just keep going." Nodding, he accelerated, watching the hitchhiker disappear in the rearview mirror. But as he glanced back one last time, his heart nearly stopped. The hitchhiker was standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at them, his eyes gleaming unnaturally in the darkness. And though they sped off, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that those cold eyes were still watching, following them deeper into the night. They finally reached Eldridge, or at least what seemed to be the outskirts of it. The place was barely more than a handful of rundown buildings and a lone gas station, the neon sign flickering faintly in the darkness. Relief flooded Tom as he pulled up to the pump, the tank dangerously low. The station was deathly silent, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. As Tom filled the tank, Sarah wandered into the convenience store, hoping to grab some snacks and drinks. She disappeared into the store, and Tom finished pumping gas, his gaze drawn to the surrounding desert, feeling an unsettling presence watching him. Inside, Sarah scanned the aisles, but the store was strangely empty. The shelves were lined with dusty, outdated products, and the fluorescent lights flickered sporadically. An old man appeared at the counter, his eyes sunken and his face devoid of expression. "Need anything?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. Sarah offered a polite smile, grabbing a few snacks, but as she reached for a soda, the old man's voice stopped her cold. "Best get out of here," he muttered, glancing nervously at the door. "Eldridge ain't kind to strangers after dark." Before she could respond, the man leaned in closer, his eyes intense. "And don't let him see you. Don't look back. He'll follow you if you do." Sarah returned to the car, visibly shaken. Tom noticed her pale face and reached out, but she just shook her head, muttering, "Let's go, Tom. Now." As they sped out of Eldridge, Tom glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. In the faint glow of the station's lights, he could make out a figure standing at the edge of the road, a tall, shadowy man with hollow eyes staring directly at them. It was the hitchhiker. "Sarah, that man. He's following us. I saw him back on the road and now he's here." Sarah glanced back and saw nothing but darkness. "There's no one there, Tom. Just keep driving." The car roared forward, and Tom's hands tightened around the steering wheel as he tried to shake the dread that gripped him. Despite the miles they'd covered, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often he'd glance in the mirror and catch a glimpse of those hollow eyes, only for them to vanish the moment he blinked. After hours of driving in tense silence, they spotted a rundown motel on the side of the highway. Desperate for sleep, they decided to stop for the night, hoping the morning would wash away the unsettling events. They checked in quickly, the place nearly empty, and found their room near the back of the property. The room itself was no better, dusty, with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights that seemed to cast more shadows than light. Tom pulled the curtains shut, trying to block out the dark highway and the lingering feeling that they hadn't left the hitchhiker far enough behind. Around midnight, Sarah jolted awake, a strange scratching sound echoing from the window. She held her breath, straining to hear. There it was again, a slow, deliberate scrape. Terrified, she shook Tom awake, whispering, "Listen." They sat in silence, the scratching growing louder, like nails dragged across glass. Trembling, Tom reached for his phone's flashlight, shining it toward the window. The light illuminated the outline of a figure, tall and distorted, its eyes hollow and glinting like dark marbles, staring directly at them from the other side of the thin glass. Panicking, Tom grabbed Sarah's hand and bolted for the car, not daring to look back as they fled. The figure followed them, gliding silently through the parking lot, its hollow gaze unblinking. They threw their bags in the back seat and sped off, the tires screeching against the cracked pavement as they raced toward the open highway. For miles, they drove in silence, their breathing heavy as they tried to process the horror they'd just escaped. But as dawn broke, a feeling of relief washed over them, the pale light of morning seeming to melt away the shadows of the night. Finally, convinced they were safe, they pulled over to catch their breath, laughing shakily at the absurdity of it all. But as Tom adjusted his rearview mirror, his laughter died. There in the reflection was the same shadowy figure, standing at the edge of the road, watching them. It was still following them,